So, origins of life on Earth, coming from nothing into something, is a crazy, crazy, crazy concept. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So hopefully some of you were with me last week when we talked about biochemistry, because a lot of those concepts are going to be coming back when we talk about macromolecules and how they tie into the origin of life on Earth. So definitely, if you have that PowerPoint and you want it up next to you or what have you, you can certainly do that. I'm about to share you on my PowerPoint for today. Lots of pictures this time. So make sure you're paying attention. I always suggest that you have like a piece of paper out next to you so that you can be taking notes, or you can just make a copy of my PowerPoint and type notes into the PowerPoint that you can look back onto. But definitely have something nearby so that you can be taking down additional notes, because there's going to be a lot of extra information today, because we're talking about how life started, and that's crazy complicated. So stay tuned. All right, let's jump in. Okay. Origins of life, crazy things happening. Okay, so we're starting, and I'm very dramatic. Hopefully you know that by now if you've been on a few of my sessions, okay? But we are starting on the early Earth here, and we are talking about how we got life out of truly nothing. So if you take a look at this picture right now, this is obviously not a real photograph because none of us were alive at the origin of the Earth, okay? But this is some like 4.5 billion years ago when our Earth started to form. As you can see, it doesn't look like a real hospitable place, okay? We have lots of toxic gases, volcanoes, lightning. Like the surface of the Earth hasn't even hardened yet. The plates are probably moving against one another as they do very rapidly, creating earthquakes. Very little water because it's really, really hot. There's no atmosphere or ozone that is protecting us from the UV rays of the sun. UV radiation can just come in and permeate the surface very easily. And somehow, which is our topic for today, we're going to get life out of this, right? Which is totally crazy and nuts to think about. But with a few key steps and just a few billion years, if you can even fathom what that would look like, we can actually have life out of this. But it requires a lot of spontaneity. So you have to feel kind of comfortable with the fact that these processes that we're talking about are taking millions of years for the most part. Okay, so it's not like it happened overnight. And you also have to realize that like molecules and things move, right? And so spontaneously, sometimes two things will form a collision. That's just going to happen, right? And there are certain things that are going to increase the frequencies of those collisions, which is going to help us to create some actual living things or parts of living things, organic material, okay? So wanted to start with a little drama, show you this picture of what early Earth might have looked like. And yeah, just kind of get you excited to start talking about this. All right, refresher. Hopefully you were with us last week, but we have four main things here that are just basically larger and larger versions of one another. Okay, so we have those atoms. So atoms certainly, obviously, were on the planet before life. So we had a lot of gases. We had a lot of methane. We had a lot of, so methane, CH4, ammonia, and NH3. No oxygen, and we'll talk about that, no oxygen. That's oftentimes like a trick question on the AP exam. They'll be like, which one of these things was not present on early Earth? And everyone just assumes oxygen was present because this is Earth. But we didn't have any of that hanging around. We had lots of other mainly toxic gases. From those gases, we're going to need to form these bottom things, which would be considered sorry, I lost my screen for a second. Oh, there we go. Which would be considered like compounds or molecules that are coming together with lots of different atoms. And eventually we're going to have to make those macromolecules that we talked about last week, right? Because these are the building blocks of life, okay? So if we're talking about building life, we're going to be talking about building the building blocks before building life itself. So those are going to be proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. Because all of those things need to exist if we're going to make a cell. Cells are full of proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. And so if we're going to make something that's actually technically alive, we're going to need to make those things. okay? Another really important thing to remember is that not only do we need these macromolecules, but we need to know the definition of what a living thing is. So the creation of life on Earth is going to start with the creation of a cell. And in order for something to be considered alive, it needs to be able to replicate and it needs to be able to produce energy. So if it can replicate and has a metabolism or is capable of producing energy, then we would consider that thing living. So proteins are not alive, lipids are not alive, nucleic acids are not alive, but if we put them all together into a cell that can replicate and produce its own energy, now we're talking life. Okay, so that's the goal today. We're going to talk about how cells are made, and then I'll show you like bigger picture how some other stuff is made as well. All right, this is super, super, super important to understand. So these are the 4 main steps that took place in order to, and we're going to go into detail for all 4, in order to create life on Earth. Okay, and it makes sense as we're going through. We're like building off of the step previously because we're making more complex things. But the first thing that needs to happen, because again, we have just a bunch of gases and nothing organic. Organic are the building blocks of life, carbon-containing building blocks of life. So if you take organic chemistry, you'll talk about carbon all day, every day. But the first step is going to be abiotic synthesis. So abiotic, without life, non-living synthesis. Synthesis would mean to put together of small organic molecules, okay? And I'm going to go through each of these in detail with its own slide, so stay tuned, okay? Second step, we're going to join these small organic molecules into macromolecules like proteins and nucleic acids and things like that, okay? So we're going to go from small organic molecules or building blocks into these macromolecules, okay? Next, these macromolecules are going to be packaged into something we call a protocell. Okay, so now we're getting towards what a cell might actually be. And then lastly, after all these macromolecules already exist inside this enclosed space called a protocell, we're going to have the origin of self-replicating molecules that lead to the capability of inheritance, which is a fancy way of saying that we're going to get some RNA that can self-replicate itself. Okay, because we don't have the enzymes, we don't have RNA polymerase or DNA polymerase yet that are going to be working and doing those things for us. Okay. So these things are actually going to be self-replicating with the help of like kind of their own enzyme system. More on that in a bit. Okay, so first things first, abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules. What are those small organic molecules? Mainly proteins, nucleic acids, or nucleotides, which you can see over on the right-hand side of your screen, right? And these are going to be kind of some of those first precursors. So if you're seeing the components that are making these up, there's oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, for the most part, are going to be the main things that are making these guys up. So when I show you this next experiment, which is really, really important, or any of the next theories of how organic molecules could have come onto Earth's surface, it's important to keep in mind exactly what we're looking for here. We need that nitrogen source, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen. So while I said that there wasn't any free gas oxygen like O2 on Earth, there was oxygen wrapped up in other compounds, just not O2 that's breathable or contained into the atmosphere. All right, so couple theories with how we have this abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules, or how we could have possibly gotten nucleotides or amino acids onto the surface of the Earth, like the picture that I showed you in the beginning, where everything looks super, super toxic, okay? A couple different ideas. Obviously, none of us were there, right? So you have to kind of just realize that scientists have spent a really, really long time working to figure out how this is possible with lots of different experiments. And that's where we've gotten where we are, knowing what we know. Will we ever know for sure? I don't believe so, because something that we probably can't prove with definitive ability, but we have proved multiple times with multiple different ways that the production of these organic molecules is possible given what we know about early Earth's environment, okay? So a couple theories here. One, scientists do believe, and they have shown via experiments with the gases that would have been present and the temperature of the atmosphere and all sorts of other things, that the atmosphere of early Earth is reducing, okay? So I'm going to teach you, and you might already know this if you've been in chemistry, but I'm going to teach you a little acronym here. Super, super important. So if you were with me last week when we talked about electrons and molecules, we talked about how a bond between two molecules is just the sharing of electrons. So if we want to make more bonds, like we're trying to build an organic molecule, we need lots of electrons, okay? So I'm going to give you this acronym here. Oh, it actually might show up backwards. It shows up backwards. Okay, I don't think I can write this backwards, although I will certainly try. Oh, I might have. It just looks terrible. Oh my gosh, I did it. Okay. Oil rig. So if you've taken a chemistry class, you've definitely heard this. But what oil rig stands for is that oxidation, or an oxidizing atmosphere, is the loss of electrons. Okay, so the electrons are spontaneously being lost, or bonds are breaking in an oxidizing environment. On the flip side, reduction is, or a reducing atmosphere is, gain of electrons. So things are spontaneously gaining electrons if the environment is reducing. Okay, so scientists have basically proven and theorized that the environment, especially near volcanoes, which there were a bajillion of because the plates weren't solid yet, and so lava was pouring up through the surface, were incredibly reducing. And remember, reduction is gain of electrons. So molecules were naturally gaining electrons, which means they're naturally capable of forming more bonds, which makes it a little bit easier to get some small organic molecules out of just individual atoms or smaller molecules. Okay, so that's one idea that scientists have proven to be true. Second theory, meteorites. Some scientists believe that perhaps meteorites or space rocks came from a different planet and brought with it kind of some building blocks or some amino acids or some nucleotides or something like that, which would be crazy. And perhaps that means that there's aliens out there. If there's other building blocks out there, who knows? But that is another theory that scientists have posed, that these actually came kind of pre-made on a meteorite. More likely than that, though, is that we're going to use the energy. So sources of energy like lightning and volcanoes, we're going to use that heat and that energy and use that to kind of combine ammonia and methane into these more complex things. And remember that this is not happening overnight. It takes, and I'll show you a graphic in a little bit, it takes a really, really long time to synthesize small organic molecules into something that's going to be usable, because we don't see life for like 1.4 billion years or something ridiculous, something that long. And so it's important to realize that this is taking a very long time to occur. Okay, so you absolutely must be familiar with the Miller-Urey experiment. I'm sure your teacher will talk to you about it if they haven't already. I'm sure they will test you on it, and it usually shows up on AP exams. But Miller and Urey are two scientists working at the University of Chicago, and they basically recreate early Earth's environment in this crazy contraption that you see here. Okay, so they have water, they have methane, they have ammonia, and they have hydrogen in a container. So those were all gases. So water vapor, ammonia, methane, hydrogen gases that would have been present on early Earth's surface. And then they have a spark from like electrodes going through it that would represent perhaps lightning or the energy provided by a volcano, right? Because there has to be some sort of energy source if we're going to see this kind of spontaneous combination. And then what they do is they let this spark with the gases, right, for an extended period of time. And then they cool this down and they run it through water, warm water. They cool it and then they put it through some warm water, which you can see this heating source at the bottom. And they continue this process and then allowing this to evaporate again, which will bring these gases back up and cooling it. And over time, with the spark, with the spontaneity of bonds and the reducing environment that they create, they were actually able to take this water out and sample it, and they were able to find amino acids in that water. Okay, so basically what they did is they proved to a lot of very skeptical people that this theory of like spontaneity with these gases present and this energy source and this water source actually could lead to something as magnificent as an amino acid over time. Kind of crazy, but pretty cool and a really, really important experiment to know about because it kind of shook our world. This happened in the early 50s. Shook our world as to how the early Earth could be described and the overall theory of how life began. Okay, so this is all still just step one. How are we getting those building blocks, amino acids and proteins? Okay, so I provided a lot of different theories there for you. Miller-Urey is the most important one to know about, but you need to know that these amino acids and these nucleotides and these other building blocks could have certainly spontaneously arisen from the early Earth conditions. Will we ever know for sure? No, but it can happen, right? So 2, this is way simpler. All the rest are simpler than that one. Joining of small organic molecules into macromolecules. So now we have all those little monomers that are around. And in a 2009 study, they actually proved that those could spontaneously assemble into polymers, especially in the presence of hot sand, clay, or rocks. So when you have a hot substrate, something that these materials can sit on, it actually promotes assembly, which is kind of crazy, but scientists have proven that. They've gotten like hot sand, clay, or rocks, which all would have been available on early Earth's surface. Everything was very hot. And from these monomers that we just talked about, they can actually spontaneously assemble into polymers and form bonds, especially if the environment was reducing where electrons were kind of free and easy to pick up. And they will naturally be drawn towards one another because they have the same sort of chemical composition. So it's not a far stretch to realize that these would come together. So once they come together, now we have macromolecules. Now we're really cooking with fire, and we just need to start assembling these into cells in order to get some life to happen. And that is what happens next. So the assembly of macromolecules in something called a protocell. Okay, so what I want you to picture in your head is taking like a drop of oil and putting it onto water. And I'm sure you can visualize that in your head right now, right? If you have a drop of oil and you put it into a container of water, it's just going to form like a little bubble spontaneously, and it's not going to mix with water. Water and oil don't mix. You can shake it all up, right? And it will still form those like little individual oil bubbles throughout water, but it's never going to completely mix because water and oil hate each other. Oil is incredibly, obviously it's a lipid that's incredibly hydrophobic. Water is water. Sorry guys, I don't know why I keep yawning. Something's wrong with me. But water is water, and so those two things don't mix. So if you can picture little droplets of lipids, which would have been present in early Earth, would spontaneously kind of form into little bubbles, just because if they're in water, they don't like that, and they're very hydrophobic. Okay, so basically what happens is these little bubbles would trap whatever was around them in their environment. So if they're sitting in some sort of like soup of amino acids and nucleotides that have been formed into kind of maybe some macromolecules, and lipids get dropped in and then just kind of spontaneously form their little bubble, they're going to take a little part of that soup and those organic materials into that bubble with them. And this is a really, really important step to forming life because now we have all of our materials in one close location. Like if your parents make you like sit down at the kitchen table and force you to talk to your sibling to come up with a solution, now all of these things are forced to be in a really tight area. And now we can start seeing things like a metabolism or replication occur because they're not like all just in this giant pond somewhere on the surface of the earth, but they're in a nice enclosed space. So this diagram is important because it just shows the type of clay that we believe to be present on early Earth. They call montmorillonite. Your guess is as good as mine. But this clay actually helps, and you can see this, the relative increase in the production of precursor molecules, and then therefore protocells in this time. So it's kind of going back to what I said before, where like hot sand, hot clay, and hot rocks serve as kind of a catalyst to speed up those reactions. Okay, so these little lipids, just like we have the lipid bilayer, and we'll talk about that a lot shortly here, I think next week. We have this lipid bilayer that's wrapped around our cells. Lipids were the same outer protection of protocells. Proto, think of like prototype, like the original kind of precursor to the real deal. And that's what's happening here. And now we have the means to actually have all these materials in one small place, therefore can bump into one another, and we can see the magic start to happen. Protocells, that's another picture for you of those little bubbles and how they would form. Okay, last step, creation of self-replicating means of inheritance. Wow. Okay, so this is what you need to take away from this. You need to know that scientists are 99% sure that while they used to think that DNA was the first method of inheritance because it just made more sense, if you really think about it, it makes a lot more sense that RNA would be the first actual piece of inheritance, genetic material. So the RNA World Hypothesis is pretty widely accepted by scientists everywhere. And there's a lot of different reasons for how scientists think, or why scientists think that RNA instead of DNA was the inherent material, the first genetic material. Wow, words. But one, and most importantly, is that scientists have proved that RNA can serve as its own enzyme, which is crazy. DNA cannot, but RNA can serve as its own enzyme. They actually call it a ribozyme, and it can make short replications of RNA. So I can't even go into the details of how that actually occurs because that's like super high level, like doctoral and past level of biochemistry. But scientists have been able to prove in the lab that RNA can actually kind of serve as its own enzyme and replicate itself. Okay. What you need to think about then to make even more sense of this, RNA is single-stranded and relatively stable on its own if it has like certain base pair combinations. Okay. So it makes a lot more sense that we would start with a single-stranded, simpler genetic material that's actually capable of its own reproduction or own replication in certain circumstances than to think about DNA, and we will talk about this for sure when we get into talking about DNA, which has to be unzipped, which then has to have another enzyme that comes and replicates it. There's a lot of different things that have to happen for DNA to replicate. So the fact that RNA is really simple and single-stranded and can sort of spur that own reaction and by itself makes it a way better choice for probably what the first genetic material was. Okay, so now we have genetic material, we have macromolecules, we have all of these things inside of our protocells. They are going to, over time, spontaneously create reactions that are going to allow them to replicate. And then after a very long period of time, we will actually see life beginning. Right? But these are the steps, the precursor steps that have been taken in order to make basically the first cell. So if you can picture like a cardboard drawing of the first iPhone, that's basically what we just created. And over time, it develops and it gets more and more advanced. And then we see life on Earth. So here we go. Love this analogy. So I'm going to reference this a bunch tonight because it's one of my favorite analogies because it just provides a really strong visual. But we can actually picture a football field, so all 100 yards, okay, as the timeline of the Earth. And it allows us to actually kind of visualize in our mind how long these things are taking to happen and how far away we are now from the start of the Earth, okay? So at one end zone, we would put the origin of the Earth. So this would be 4.5 billion years ago. So our Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago at the earliest. We have some data that says it could actually be a little bit older, okay? And then up here at the 15-yard line, which is going to be like 3.8 billion years ago, is when we have life forming. Okay, so it took a whole 15 yards, right? It took a whole like almost 1 billion years from when the Earth first formed for us to actually get life to happen. And we're gonna revisit this a lot as we add on other things and see more complex life occurring. But yeah, so keep this visual in your mind. But it took a whole 15 yards just to get life to begin from the origin of. All right, how do we know all of this stuff, and how do we know like 4.5 billion years, 3.8 billion years? Great question. It's hard to know for sure, right? And again, we weren't there, so we have been part of Earth for such little time. At the end, I'll tell you what we would look like our time on Earth on the football field. But the way that we can do this is by measuring isotopes. Okay, so what an isotope is, it's like I'm trying to think of like isomer. We've talked about. Have we talked about any other iso? Not really. I'm trying to think of more examples of what to compare it to. But what an isotope is it's basically a version of a compound that just has a different number of electrons. So we have like carbon 12, electrons and neutrons. We have carbon 12 and then we have carbon 14. which has 2 extra components to it that makes it a little bit bigger. And these things just kind of occur naturally. But if you have something that has an isotope that has some extra either protons or neutrons or electrons in it, it will break down over time. And we know how long it takes those substances to break down because we have labs and we've watched it happen in real time. So what we can do is we can actually extrapolate or work backwards, right? So if we know that it takes 40 years for carbon-14 to half in size, we can take a look at like old school fossils or old school rocks and determine how much of a substance they have left in them, and then kind of work backwards to see how old that substance is based on how long it would take for that thing to break down based on its half-life. So I know that was like a really brief explanation there, because it's not super, super critical. But if you're like, what in the world, how are scientists figuring this out? That's how. It's by looking at how basically substances or compounds have broken down over time and using rules that we know to be true based on what we've seen in the present day. And then kind of working backwards from that and seeing like, oh, if this thing has 1 gram of this left, then it probably started, 4 billion years ago with 100 grams or something like that. So that's how we're dating all of this stuff, or a lot of this stuff. And then there's other methods as well that scientists have developed over the years that are incredibly precise. But this is definitely one main way that this happens. Okay, so we're going to jump in now. So we've talked about how we got life on Earth. We've talked about what that looks like on our football field. And now we're going to start adding some more things to the picture. So this is like a clock, basically. But it puts the origin of Earth right here at about 4.5, 4.6 billion years ago, right? And then as we move around the clock, it takes like about 1 billion years, not quite, for prokaryotes or those single-celled organisms to appear, right? And then you'll see it takes another really long time, basically 1 billion years, for oxygen to appear, okay? And then it takes even longer for single-celled eukaryotes to appear. Okay, so prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, I have a picture up there, but prokaryotes are going to be like our bacterial cells that we think of today. They don't have any membrane-bound organelles. They don't have a nucleus, none of that. So it actually took a really long time for eukaryotes to come around, and then multicellular eukaryotes after that. So this is a really helpful graphic. We're going to be talking through these individual points over the next couple of slides, but definitely come back to it, and you can see kind of the progression and just how long everything took to get to where we are right now. Okay. All right. So next in line. So again, if we look back here, we just talked about how prokaryotes were. We talked about the origin of Earth. We talked about the appearance of prokaryotes. Now we need to talk about oxygen, because obviously we breathe oxygen, and most everything on Earth needs oxygen, except for some of our anaerobic friends, like the bacteria in your gut and things like that. But it didn't come around for a really long time, like a really long time, like almost 2 billion years is how long it took for oxygen to appear. And I'm going to show you on that football field example, but it's like almost half of Earth's existence was without atmospheric oxygen, and then oxygen appears, okay? Just totally nuts. And it accumulates to the point where we can actually form an atmosphere like we have today. Like the oxygen just isn't like floating off into the rest of the solar system. So this is called the oxygen revolution. Again, it happened about 2 billion years ago. And basically what happened is we had things called cyanobacteria. So some of my students, and it's kind of a common misconception, but don't let this happen. They'll be like, oh, well, plants created the oxygen on the planet. Okay, and then I would refer them back to this picture, because we're still living in just prokaryote time. We don't even have eukaryotes, let alone multicellular eukaryotes, let alone colonizing land and doing all that planty plant stuff, okay? So actually the first photosynthesizers, right, which is how we got oxygen on our planet, are what we call cyanobacteria, C-Y-A-N-O bacteria. And those are photosynthetic bacteria, and we still have them on the planet today. But we basically just started to see this rapid increase, right? And basically what happened is almost like natural selection. The things that could tolerate the oxygen survived and figured out how to use oxygen or create oxygen, and the things that couldn't died. So we actually saw like 75% or more of species that were alive, or not species, but cells that were alive prior to the oxygen revolution died because they couldn't hang. Oxygen to them was very toxic, which sounds crazy because obviously we need it to survive, but it was very toxic. And so the only things that really remained were things that could either tolerate or create oxygen themselves, which is a really, really important time that comes next on our little journey. Okay. So now we actually have an atmosphere that has enough oxygen that things can utilize it. And now we have to wait like another, I don't know, 800 million years to get single-celled eukaryotes. Okay, so everything takes a really long time. We can't even fathom it. Okay, so how in the world do we get eukaryotes then? So we have our prokaryotes. That took long enough, right? That explanation was nuts. Right? Then we get this oxygen because we have some of these photosynthetic bacteria. Okay, but now we need to form eukaryotes, so things with organelles and all of that jazz. And it's obviously a complex process. As you can see from this figure, this helps explain it. But a lot of the membranes the membranes inside of the cell, like the membrane organelles, come from kind of like the inside or the outside of the cell kind of folding in and forming those ridges, which is what you can see up here in this picture, that we kind of just had these ridges of membrane from the outside kind of fold in. And that's what basically created our nucleus and our endoplasmic reticulum. Again, this was over 800 million years, right? So long time, okay? But these things kind of folded in over time, wrapped up around the DNA. That would be seen as an advantage because that DNA is more protected. And then we have this endoplasmic reticulum, okay? And then these like precursors to eukaryotic cells, which is what this like middle, mainly purple cell is, are what are going to be the building blocks of what we know as eukaryotic cells, okay? So what I'm telling you about right now is something super, super important called endosymbiont theory. Endosymbiont theory. I'll try to write that backwards on the card because I realized I didn't write it on the slide. So let me see. My mirror handwriting is going to be oh my gosh, this is so hard. You're going to be like, this does not say what you think it does. Maybe it will though. It looks like a preschooler wrote this. That doesn't say what I wanted to. This is backwards. Endosymbiont theory. Wow, the struggle is real apparently for my mirror writing. Okay, so endosymbiont theory is super, super important, and it's basically going to tell us how our mitochondria appeared, and it's the basis for the fact that our mitochondria was once a freestanding prokaryote, okay? How are we getting eukaryotes? Well, partly this infolding of the membrane for sure, because that's going to give us some membrane-bound organelles, but also a bigger prokaryote ate a smaller prokaryote, and that's actually going to form a whole entire organelle, specifically one of our most important ones, the mitochondria, okay? So that's what is being shown here, right? So this precursor eukaryotic cell is engulfing a prokaryote, and it's a prokaryote that is heterotrophic and aerobic, okay? So it's producing its own energy, which is pretty amazing. So some prokaryotes at the time were producing their own energy, and basically this precursor eukaryote, I mean, over, again, 800 million years, precursor eukaryotes were eating up these little guys, but instead of digesting them, they're actually gaining energy from them because these are highly energy producing prokaryotes. And that's a real big benefit to the cell because now it doesn't need to go find things to eat. It has this energy producer inside of it where it's more able to break down the things that it's eating because of this energy producer. And that was hugely, hugely, hugely helpful to that cell, which would give it an advantage to survive and reproduce more. And now we have a whole fleet of amazing eukaryotic cells. Then over time, those same really amazing eukaryotic cells probably engulfed a photosynthetic prokaryote, perhaps a cyanobacteria, which would have been the precursor then to the plant cell. Okay, so how do we know this to be true? Well, there's a lot of different data. There's a lot of different evidence that shows that our mitochondria was probably once a freestanding prokaryote, but something that you might not know about your mitochondria. So here's my really great picture of a mitochondria. we should know that it's the powerhouse of the cell, hopefully, okay? And it has all these membranes in the inside, okay? But something you might not know is that your mitochondria actually has its own set of circular DNA in it, which is crazy, okay? Why is that crazy? Well, one, we don't have circular DNA. We have chromosomes, right? We have linear DNA, okay? The only things that have circular DNA are prokaryotes, right? So this is crazy. There's no reason for us to have circular DNA if it wasn't a precursor to, or wasn't, part of a prokaryote at one point. So that's pretty nuts. And that's one of our main pieces of evidence. But two, it just allows for this idea that this guy probably existed on its own at one point with its own DNA. Okay. Kind of fun fact about the mitochondrial DNA is it's 100% maternal. It 100% comes from your mom. So while everything else of you is a 50-50 mix for the most part between mom and dad's chromosomes, this guy comes directly from mom, which is kind of a crazy, weird phenomenon. But we can actually talk about it a little bit when we get to genetics in a long while. And we talk about mitochondrial diseases, because there are a few. All right. Back to my favorite analogy, okay? The football field, okay? So this is pretty crazy, okay? But here's the origin of Earth, right? All the way down here. So we have life beginning at the 15-yard line, and then photosynthesis starts at about the 20-yard line, but we don't actually have enough oxygen to make an atmosphere, which is what I was referring to at that when we talked about the oxygen revolution, right? Until the 48-yard line. Okay, so truly, if you're looking at this football field, for this first half of the Earth's life, there's been nothing but some single-celled organisms, no oxygen, no nothing for half of the Earth's existence, right? And then right around this 50-yard line, we finally have enough oxygen for an atmosphere, right? The first eukaryotes don't appear until like 80, no, not 80. My math is terrible. 50, 60, 63 yards in, right, is when these first eukaryotes are going to start to appear. And we don't see multicellular organisms until like 82 yards in, right? So all the way over here, right, if you can picture this, these 18 yards are like all of multicellular organisms' history, right? So if the Earth is 100 yards, these 18 just on the right-hand side are all multicellular organisms' history, and I'm going to show you just how crazy that is, okay? But hopefully this puts into perspective just how long these things take and how we are so far from being the center of this Earth, because we've been around for like 0 parts of it, okay? All right, next step, if you're going back to this clock, now we have single-celled eukaryotes, and now we need to get into multicellular eukaryotes, animals, colonization of land, all that good stuff. Okay, so this all happens with help of the Cambrian Explosion, this period of time where we see marine life just absolutely booming, because marine life existed long before anything got onto land. Okay, so the Cambrian Explosion, you should just know, is this explosion of marine life and diversity, probably because quickly changing and vastly different environments and food sources, right, that are going to lead to rapid amounts of natural selection or adaptive radiation from when we talked about that in evolution. And so we see all of these things. Now, this sounds crazy, but it was like a 30 or 40 million year period, which is still a crazy long period of time. But as far as the span of the Earth goes, it's actually very, very, very short that we're seeing all of this diversity come into play. So lots of really, really fun sea creatures show up during the Cambrian Explosion. Okay, and then our next step, kind of as we're getting across today, is the colonization of land. Okay, basically over time, and evolution has shown this, and fossil records have shown this, the appendages, these swimming appendages, are going to become more distinct for land, right? And these tails are going to become, instead of more like fishy tails, more like land animal tails. These animals are going to be able to gain a lot of mass because they no longer need to be buoyant. They're no longer swimming through water, and so they're just, crawling and being lazy on land. And we see this general progression over time in evolution. I'm not even going to go into all the details because there are so many, but in our next step, we kind of see this evolution and we see this booming of colonization on land, which takes place long after long after we see all these sea creatures. Okay, so kind of crazy, but we're going to see the colonization of land. If we go back to our football field, I don't think I put it on there, but it was 530 million years ago. Okay, and it's going to be at about the 8.5. So about the opposing team's 11-yard line, about right here where my mouse is. Right, that's where we're actually going to see land colonized, which means things have only been living on land for about 10 yards of the Earth's history. Okay, or 540 million years out of 4.5 billion. 540 million is nothing. Okay, and that's everything that's ever been on land is just in that tiny little like red zone at the end if you're a football fan. Okay, all right. So the couple other things that I wanted to go through, I actually want to keep on this football analogy. It's already on my questions. But do you guys have any questions so far? No. Maybe you've tuned me out. Okay. All right. Well, a few other things then, just to talk about is going to be the fact that once life hits Earth in these 10 yards at the end, we just see an absolutely rapid burst in diversity taking place and lots and lots of crazy things happening. So for reference, about 514 million years ago, we have more like developed fish. Plants appear 421 million years ago. So plants are actually more evolved than like fish or other sea creatures, which is pretty crazy. So that would be at about the 91 yard or like the 9 yard of the opposing team, which is pretty nuts. Insects, 374 million years ago. Sharks, 328. Amphibians, 281 million years ago, just like 6 yards from the end zone at this point. Dinosaurs, so this is nuts. Our first dinosaurs actually would appear like at this 95-yard mark or 5 yards away from the end zone. So all of dinosaurs, all of those crazy things that you think of from prehistoric times, all of that happened like right in this little range, right before the end zone, so close to where we are right now, as opposed to like where we started, which is really, really nuts if you think about it. Okay, so then we have this huge mass extinction, and this is really important to know about. So there's 6 major mass extinctions. I'm certain that we're in one currently as well because humans are ruining everything. Okay, but at this 1 yard line, okay, or AKA, I can tell you the actual time, 46 million years ago. Okay, we are going through a massive extinction that takes out 75% of all life on Earth. Okay, just 1 yard of this entire thing. So just so recently, 46 million years ago, we knock out 75% of life. But with that, after these mass extinctions, we see times of this adaptive radiation because of the things left, we just see this diversity just absolutely bursting forth. Because now there's no competition, like everything is fair game, everything starts fresh. We have all this new life booming, and then we see a ton of diversity. So in that last yard of the football field, after that mass extinction, is when we see pretty much everything that you can think about today. Okay, so armadillos, whales, wolves, great apes appeared 15 million years ago. Hippos appeared 5 million years ago. Mammoths, lions, Lucy, if you've heard of Lucy, who was like human-like, the first like sort of human kind of mix between this like great ape ancestor and our today humans, was 3.2 million years ago. Saber-toothed cattle. And then this is the crazy part. Humans have only been on Earth for 200,000 years. 200,000 years. So if you picture an eighth of an inch, so I'm going to get a ruler out. It's going to be backwards for you guys, but that's okay. And you picture 1/8 of an inch. It's about the width of like a pencil, right? If you put a pencil down at the end of the yard line on your school's football field, right? A pencil down right on the yard line. That width, in comparison to the entire field, that is how long humans have been on Earth. It's like one finger's width. So this distance of time, 200,000 years, is how long humans have been on Earth in comparison to the entire 100 yards of the football field. So we have been on Earth for absolutely no time. Somehow we have found a way to destroy it in every way possible. But as far as the history of life, and that's why this is crazy to just kind of have in one sort of lesson, but as far as the history of life goes, like we have been around for absolutely none of it. So hopefully this graphic helps you. There's a great video. I'll actually share it with you because I got the idea. Football field, timeline of the Earth. Let me just get the link really quick. It's really, really interesting. At least I think it's really interesting because I just think it's crazy that all of these things appear so quickly. Okay, but I'll share this link with you guys because I think it's valid, and you can take a look. Okay, but the big things to remember from today are the 4 steps to the first life or the first prokaryotic cell on Earth. Okay, so getting those organic compounds into macromolecules, into protocells, and then the creation of that basically self-replicating RNA. Okay, so those are really important to know. It's important to know that there was no oxygen present at the beginning of Earth. It's important to know that oxygen eventually appears because of photosynthetic cyanobacteria, but it took like basically half the Earth's history to build up enough oxygen and create an atmosphere enough for actual organisms to use that oxygen. Eukaryotes are coming about via something we call endosymbiosis, okay, where we have larger prokaryotes eating smaller energetic prokaryotes and creating what we would consider the first eukaryotic cells. And then multicellular organisms and the colonization of land happened very, very recently. And the diversity of life has really sprung up so quickly for such a short period of time. If you think back to like the fact that we have 300,000 species of beetles, right? And that beetles have not been around for very long, it's pretty nuts to think about. So that is the origins of life. Make sure you sign up. I'm going to send you the link really quick to the Fiveable website so that you can make sure that you sign up for my sessions, and that will give you live sessions for the rest of the year as well as any replays, right? Because right now you're like, origin of life, I don't really care, or who cares? It's only October 2nd, right? But I can promise you that on like May 1st, when you're cramming and you're just trying to figure out how to get by, you are going to want to rewatch this video and be like, hey, what is the origin of life about and what do I need to remember from this? And having those replays is essential to that. So right now it's $20 to sign up for one subject. So I'm sending you another link. It's the sign up link. It's $20 to sign up for one subject. And again, that means that you can access everything for the rest of the year. Weekly live sessions. You can obviously ask me any questions, even though none of you did tonight. You can access all my replays, include all the way up through the rest of the year. And obviously you get all these videos, etc. Okay, so definitely sign up. Totally worth your time. We're going to continue cruising through all of these really, really important things throughout the course of the year together. Next week, we're going to talk more about cell transport and cell structures. So we're actually going to move into those cells that we just talked about originating. So hopefully that's something that you think is helpful. And I can't wait to see you then. So have a great night. Next week, we'll be back to the normal Wednesday schedule. Again, I just had that cross-country championship this week. So that's the reason why. But I'll see you next week on Wednesday at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. And I look forward to it. Have a great night. See you then.